Hey everybody, welcome back to Riverwalk Talk. My name is Chip Harrington and I am not on the Riverwalk. As you can see, I'm actually in my kitchen living room area. One thing is it's been raining like crazy this week, so I haven't been able to get out to interview somebody on the Riverwalk. And I also had some surgery this week on my cervical spine. I actually had 2 discs replaced. Maybe I'll talk about that at another show, but I am going to be showing an old episode that I had from when I had my old show back in the day. This is going to be an Our Town classic, I guess I've been calling it. And this is with Bill Bulger. I don't know if you guys recall that name, but Mr. Bulger was pretty well known in the Massachusetts political world. He was the Senate president for many, many years, served in the legislature, I think for 35 years on the House and Senate side, then retired there and went over to become the president of UMass for a period of time. So we had a really cool talk about a book that he had written at the time about James Michael Curley, who was another Boston political figure back in the day. But in the backdrop of the whole thing, we didn't talk about it, but this is Whitey Bulger's brother, his younger brother. And this episode was filmed in 2009. We did it at the Hubbard Library. And he came down from South Boston. We spent a couple hours together, had a great conversation about his book. But this is before Whitey Bulger was found out on the West Coast. And of course, as people, if you pay attention to that stuff, was eventually killed in prison by somebody that was from Springfield. Kind of a weird connection there for this part of the state. So I hope you enjoy this episode. Like I said, this is more of a historical book discussion that Mr. Bulger had written at the time about James Michael Curley, and goes into a lot of details about how, Massachusetts politics can just kind of be rough and tumble, and that guy was a pretty charismatic individual, as is and was Mr. Bulger. Billy Bulger. Whitey may have been charismatic. I don't know. Never got to know him, actually, thankfully. So enjoy the show. Take care. Hi, welcome back to Our Town. My name is Chip Harrington. I'll be your host once again this week. This is our weekly show where we try to profile either different people or issues we have on a regular basis. Today we have a very special guest, an author, and we are at the Hubbard Memorial Library in Ludlow, Massachusetts. And I've invited Mr. William Bulger, who is the author of a new book about James Michael Curley. Many people may have heard the name James Michael Curley, but Mr. Bulger has taken the time to put some personal detailed stories with it, along with some of the factual information about Mr. Curley as well, too. James Michael Curley, for those of you who don't know, was a politician around the turn of the century and the beginning part of the 1900s, and served right up through almost the 1950s, around 1946 or so. He was certainly an interesting character. Anybody who's paid any attention to Massachusetts politics knows that in Massachusetts we refer to politics as kind of almost a contact sport. And Mr. Curley, I guess you can almost say, was the founder of that campaigning method. And we're going to be talking to Mr. Bulger, who he himself is very familiar with campaigning and elected politics as well, too. So, having all that said, Mr. Bulger, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for the invitation, Chip.
For coming in. I do appreciate it. As I just mentioned at the top of the show, Massachusetts, as you well know, is referred to as a very kind of rough and tumble political environment. Mm-hmm. And James Michael Curley probably emphasizes that more than anybody. Yeah. So let's start from the beginning. Where's the inspiration for writing a book about Mr. Curley?
Well, when I was young, in the 40s, Curley was still around. Most of his life was behind him. Mm-hmm. He was elected mayor in the 40s for last time, but it was his 4th term as mayor. Mm-hmm. He had been elected way back around, I think, 1914, and then perhaps about 1922, mm-hmm. 1930, and then in the 40s again. And I think he would have been more frequently elected, except that the legislature, which was hostile to him and was of a different party, it was a Republican legislature, would frequently change the rules. And if he were in office, then they would disallow a person who is the mayor of the city mm-hmm. from being elected, re-elected. Right. So he would have to step out of office and come back. So I think he would have certainly matched the incumbent mayor,
Menino,
Tom Menino has just been re-elected to his 5th term. Mm-hmm. It begins in January. But Curley certainly would have done that, at least 5 terms. If he were allowed to succeed himself. But he was popular, and he was controversial. And he had qualities that I liked, and I liked him for his courage, his independence of thought, and when I was elected to the House of Representatives in 1960, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was elected President of the United States the same time.
Right.
And in January, I was a member of the House of Representatives when John Fitzgerald Kennedy, as the President-elect, came and visited us. He was saying goodbye to us because he was going to Washington to be sworn in as President. It just happens that in Massachusetts, under the Constitution, members of the House of Representatives and the Senate are sworn in on the first Wednesday. But in the presidential world, it's around, I think, January the 20th, or something like that, that the President of the United States becomes the President. So he had this period when we were in office and he was yet to be sworn in. And he came and visited us. And he gave a great speech. It was a speech about the qualities that he thought he should bring to that office. And the 4 qualities that he mentioned, I'll get right to this, but courage. He put a very high premium on courage. You know that he wrote the book, Profiles in Courage. And he saw the importance of courage in a public man. He also spoke of the absolute necessity of integrity, personal honesty on the part of the person who's holding the office. And then a third item was that of judgment. You have to be a person of independent judgment, a very important quality. And finally, the 4th one is dedication to the responsibilities of the office. And I often thought that Curley, he reflected some of these qualities in a superb fashion. So as a very young fellow, I liked him. And I read The Purple Shamrock, which is his biography by Joseph Dineen. I read it when I was in high school, and I liked that. And it was you know, and I came from a hugely active political area. When I ran myself in 1960, there were 16 candidates running for state representative. There has never been a shortage of candidates where I am. So, so it was an active political place, and he was a very large political figure, and I was attracted to him. So during my early part of my life, I really liked him. I think I sort of began to outgrow it as I you know, grew up and became more acquainted with other people who were worthy of emulation.
Right,
so,
right. Well, he certainly held pretty much almost every office you can think of.
He did.
He was a state representative. He was mayor several times over. A congressman, a governor for a short period of time.
An alderman.
An alderman, right? You know, in 1899, he was first elected to the Common Council, which I think is the predecessor to the City Council.
That's exactly right.
So he certainly has done, you know, everything along the whole gamut there. When you, in the book too, you talk a lot about his campaign style, and you actually refer to him that he used his voice as almost, it was almost a stage.
Oh yeah.
You know, where he would, and it would just be entertaining, you know, at some point or another.
He was entertaining.
Yeah. Did you ever get a chance to see him
Oh
campaign?
yes.
Yeah.
Oh sure. Whenever I had an opportunity to watch him, I'd do so. And I do remember him campaigning. I remember he had a habit of always quoting an Irish poet named John Boyle O'Reilly. Now, most of us would know John Boyle O'Reilly. I know there's a John Boyle O'Reilly club up this way
There
in
is.
Holyoke. Am I correct?
Springfield, actually.
Springfield,
Yep.
I'm sorry. So,
Very active.
But, but the very first school I attended was named after John Boyle O'Reilly. Just a couple of words about O'Reilly. He lived in the 19th century. He's born in 1844. And he dies only at 46 years of age back in Boston in 1890. But he has an exciting life because he is a Fenian. He's ready to overthrow British rule in Ireland. But he's also in the British military. So when he's discovered, he's sentenced to exile in Australia. And he goes in chains to Australia, John Boyle O'Reilly. And he, with the aid of a Yankee whaler, from New Bedford. He escapes and gets back here to Massachusetts. The Yankee whaler, by the way, became sheriff down there because he never dared to go to sea again because the English Navy was looking for him.
Oh, wow.
And he was afraid anyway. So he, O'Reilly, but most of us are a little familiar with some of the poetry of O'Reilly. It's not the greatest poetry, but there's lots of it. And Curley would use it all of the time. I mean, I will not inflict it on you, but one that I always used to like was, there's a huge, long poem. The name of it is The Exile of the Gale, the person who's been run out of Ireland and he ends up here. Now this would have a massive appeal in Boston at this time because more than half the population by the end of the 19th century is Irish, and it's and they're struggling.
Yep.
And people, I think, are at their best when they're struggling. You know, but I still can recall Curley reciting The Exile of the Gale, and I won't inflict the whole poem on you, but maybe a few lines. It would be something like, "No treason we bring from Erin, nor bring we shame nor guilt. The sword we hold may be broken, but we have not dropped the hilt. The wreath we bear to Columbia is twisted of thorns, not bays. And the songs we sing are saddened by thoughts of desolate days. But the hearts we bring for freedom are washed in a surge of tears, and we claim our right by a people's fight, outliving 1,000 years." And that would be enough to stir the crowd.
Right, yeah.
And on another occasion, I remember in 1951, I was only 17, but Curley was making these futile attempts to get back into public office as mayor. And he ran and did not do well. And I was at the hotel the night that he had lost, and he was way down, so I think he came in second that time, but it's a preliminary election. And the winner, John B. Hines, the incumbent mayor of the city, had so much of a vote ahead of Curley, Curley couldn't win. But what I remember about that night was that this kind of defeated crowd, I knew many of them. I knew people like John McGilvery was a friend of mine, or Charles McGilvery. He lived near me. Charles had only one arm. He had lost it. He was a hero and received the Congressional Medal of Honor for action in the Battle of the Bulge in Europe. And he was there, and all the others, but they were crestfallen because Curley's vote was so bad he could never win. But what I remember about it that night, Curley told them to set the microphones and the speakers up so that everybody out in the street could hear. And he went into a speech. He spoke of John Paul Jones on the deck of the burning Bonhomme Richard. He said, "Surrender. We've just begun to fight."
Right.
I think that crowd would have marched on City Hall, you know. But that was the special gift that he had. So anyway, those are the little experiences I had with him. Yeah.
Well, and you mentioned also too in your book that you were coming off, I think, the train or the bus one day on Government Center, and Joe Moakley was out front, an old friend from your neighborhood.
Sure, yeah.
And he was supporting the opposition.
Sure, yeah.
And he said, "Bill, you're going to be with us, right, for this guy?" And you said, "It's the only chance I'm going to get to vote for James Michael Curley, so I'm going to do it."
It was in 1955, just 4 years later, and I just come out of the Army. And Moakley said, "Would you give a vote for John Powers, who was a very good candidate from South Boston?" But I said, "No, it's the only time I'll ever see Curley's name on the ballot, so I think I'll vote for him."
Right, out of respect.
And Moakley used to get a kick out of my, being taken by that. So I lived on Logan Way in the Old Harbor Housing Project. I lived at number 41. And the Moakleys lived at number 51, very close. And they were friends. His younger brothers, Bob and Tom, were my friends. And Joe was older. But Joe actually got into the service by making his age a little higher, And we were very, very good friends.
Yeah. And you also, we talked earlier about his spirit, his campaigning spirit. And you also mentioned John F. Kennedy. Now, Kennedy's grandfather was Honey Fitz, who apparently, when I read your book, was a big rival of Curley
Oh,
at some
sure,
point.
yeah.
In fact, Curley refused to even speak at some of the events
That's
that
it.
Honey Fitz was at.
That's right.
Where did that rivalry start? And you know, those are two
Yeah.
very powerful names.
Yeah, well, you know, they came along. Fitzgerald, he lived in the North End, and Curley was out in the Roxbury area. Really I don't know, a tidal basin. It was a tough area, a tough place. It's where the Boston City Hospital is right now. And Fitzgerald had some money. He was in the insurance business, and he lived right behind St. Stephen's Church in the North End on Garden Court Street. And he served as mayor, Fitzgerald did. And then he decided not to seek re-election. And Curley defeated a fellow named Kenny in that fight. I think it's in 1914. But they were true rivals. There was a time at the temple, whatever, the foot of the Tremont Temple at Tremont Street and Park. Curley said, "I will not be in the same room as."
Right.
And I have to laugh at it because Curley himself had been in jail only a decade before, but
Right.
nevertheless, he was really, I think, posturing at the moment. And he and Fitzgerald were rivals. And in the 30s, by the way, Fitzgerald did support Curley when Curley ran for governor. And but it was an on and off rivalry. But I think it also accounted for the fact that then in the 40s, when people were, the congressional delegation was signing a pardon petition for Curley, and Jack Kennedy refused to sign it. He was the only one. And I always thought that it was because of the old rivalry with his grandfather.
Taking care of his grandfather, right? Yeah, you do mention that in the book.
Did I say that? I hope.
Yeah, you do have that in the book. And also, when you talk about Fitzgerald and their rivalry, there must have been some common respect among the two because they were fiercely, competitive in that sense as well. Yeah, as they move forward. Within that time period, when he did serve as governor, you say, Fitzgerald supported him as governor. He was only governor for one term. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And statewide now, he had to build up an alliance. And was he?
Well, he ran, and it was in 1934. Yeah. He ran against a predecessor of mine as president of the state senate, and his name was Gaspar Griswold Bacon. And Curley loved that name.
Yeah.
And I was looking at Gaspar Griswold's portrait just the other night. It was near my own in the Senate reading room. And he seemed like a very competitive fellow, Bacon. He wanted very much to have a fight with Curley, but he didn't want to, of course, fight him in Boston where Curley was strong, but rather statewide. He was sure he could defeat Curley. And so he went eagerly into the battle for the office of governor with Curley. And but Curley had great fun with the name. My opponent, Gaspar Griswold Bacon. He had this habit of doing it. And he even had a look-alike for poor Gaspar Griswold Bacon, who was around in a big chauffeur-driven car and telling workmen not to be leaning on their shovels and get to work, which made poor Gaspar unpopular. So these things that he would do, I don't think you should do them, but nevertheless he was at it. And I'm sure his opponents, in fact there are many instances where his opponents were even more lethal dealing with him.
You also talk about it. The sense I got from James Michael Curley, granted he was a fiercely competitive person, but very compassionate at the same time. You also tell a story about his mother, who came over from Ireland, in the 1800s, and he would see her constantly scrubbing floors on her hands and knees. And then he was going through City Hall and he saw a woman doing that, and he said, he sent a memo out. Nobody scrubs floors on their hands and knees in this building. So clearly a very compassionate person at the same time.
Well, he could make great gestures about it. No woman should ever be on her knees except to pray.
Right. Yeah.
And he would make the grand gestures. And as you know, he's hugely controversial because when he was very young, I think he's about 28 or 29 years of age, he's an alderman, and he and his friend Tom Curley go. They're getting jobs for people wherever they can. That's part of his role as a politician in the big city. And the appeal is not over the radio or television. We don't have those things at this time. It has to be a much more personal thing. And they were very much in the social benefits mode. And he and his friend, Tom Curley, no relation, they went down and took exams for two people who were looking for the jobs in the post office. And Curley used to say he'd make a very good postman. He said, but he's not very sharp. So they take the exam, and they're caught. And then a judge, Judge Lowell, sent them both to jail for Charles Street Jail for 90 days. And so it was a good, heavy punishment. But you can never make an excuse for it. He shouldn't be taking the exam. And he was noticed in that jail too, by the way. I think the fellow who ran the jail said, "You watch him. He's Curley. He's going to be somebody who you should keep an eye on because he has a great future." He had noticed that Curley was in the library all of the time, and he read extensively. And then, by the way, so he's an alderman at the time, and he's re-elected while he's there. And Tom Curley is elected to the state senate. He but never sat because the Republican legislature disallowed him. He had been convicted of a felony, and he was not going to be allowed to be seated. But Curley, I just mentioned courage as a very important virtue. I believe that the fact that Curley stayed the course and ran for office again and again, right where they knew him best, and exactly where everyone knew of his misdeed, the matter of taking the exam. And he was chided constantly for it. And he paid a huge price for it, all of his life, public life especially. And still he didn't run away from it. You know, a lesser person would have said, well, I better get a job somewhere and be obscure. I might even have to go out of state. I don't want to have to be reminded of this misconduct of mine for the rest of my life. But he stood up to it. And I mean, even in the 30s and the 40s, the cartoonists would caricature him in a with a ball and a chain, prison garb. And it must have been hugely painful for himself and for his family. But that's what he endured. By the way, he had good explanations. You alluded to it a moment ago. I did it for a friend, he'd say. After a while, he just about justified it. And by the way, I think it has this effect, if I understood my own constituency, certainly, because I had their approval for 35 years. But I think if they believe that you're being treated unfairly, and this same attack is being made over and over again, at some point they make up their mind to be much more favorably disposed toward you. And I think I've had the experience myself when I've been under some kind of attack that they didn't think was fair. Then even those who are critics suddenly have reason to be well disposed toward you. So Curley, I think in an ironic fashion, began to benefit from it. They thought the attacks were unfair, these people, and they would give him a vote. He would always do very well at the polls. And I still remember as a young person, and you've asked the question why I would like him, I can still remember the newspaper saying that, warning people in the city, in West Roxbury, and in the Back Bay, and on Beacon Hill and in Brighton, be sure to vote. The weather report is very bad for next Tuesday, Election Day. And if you don't vote, the people in South Boston will be voting. Charlestown, the North End, East Boston, they were heavy Curley wards and precincts. They'll be voting, and they use this verb, I still remember, they'll be trooping to the polls. And that's what they would be doing. And that's what and so the paper was warning us of this great danger. And I still remember feeling how I always felt very proud to be part of the constituency that was not taking its marching orders from the press.
Right, and you know, as a public official, as you have been for many years, it's tough to fight the press. You know, they always get the last word.
Oh, of course,
always
they're
get
tough.
The last word.
They are.
Right.
I've had some experience.
Yes. And we're going to focus on Curley today, though. Not
Sure,
Bill
absolutely.
Bulger.
Forget me.
We'll have you back another time.
Oh, absolutely.
We'll review your history. You know, later in his life, his political career, you know, FDR became,
Right.
you know, FDR.
Yeah.
The Depression was obviously really moving forward, and many people were out of work. You know, earlier in the century, the Dust Bowl kind of wiped
Sure.
out the Midwest, and the country was really kind of in a very difficult position. And FDR came along, and you know, you talk about the convention in here, and that's an amazing story in itself.
yeah.
The convention and how Curley, you know, wasn't a part of the Massachusetts delegation.
Oh, no.
But somehow miraculously showed up as a member of the Puerto Rican delegation.
Sure.
So tell us about that a little bit.
No, well, very briefly, Curley was out of favor all across Massachusetts because Al Smith had run for president in 1928, and Irish Catholics in Massachusetts loved the prospect of Al Smith as president of the United States, and so they were, you know, just taken by him, and they were for him, and they wanted him back again in 1932. Curley had another idea. He recognized that Smith could not win, but FDR could. And he liked Franklin Roosevelt, and he had met him on a train coming to Boston one time, and they became acquainted, and he told Roosevelt that he would campaign for him. When that happened, the people they did not send Curley to the convention. He could not be a delegate because they would not send a delegate who was committed to FDR. And so at the convention, the Puerto Rican delegation was not too far from the Massachusetts delegation. And they were seated there, and the time came when the Puerto Rican delegation was called for its vote. And the spokesman was called upon, by, his name was Jamio Miglio Curlio, and everybody turned, and there he was. And he said, the entire delegation casts its ballot for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and the place went wild. It was Curley back again, and at his very best. You know, he could come from total obscurity and being crushed and then back up.
Right.
And even when he got back to Boston, I know he was at the Boston Common a day or so later, and everybody still loved the fact that he came. And of course, Roosevelt now had the nomination and was really working very hard toward a great victory. And Curley, when he first addressed these people down on the Boston Common, senors and senoritas, he began that way. It was great stuff. And,
Yeah.
and he, but there were a lot of nice stories. I remember one about at St. Augustine's Church in South Boston. He was reciting the Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. And he goes on through the Lord's Prayer, and he gets to forgive us our trespasses as we and then he noticed someone is stealing his coat out of the back of the open car. And he says, get that son of a idiot stealing my coat, as we forgive those who trespass against us. You know, famous story about him. But he had a great skill. And one on the matter of Roosevelt,
Right.
he campaigned wonderfully for Roosevelt. And if you wanted me to, I'd inflict a little of the speeches. But he spoke of the forgotten man. It was great. Roosevelt had him all over the country, and he had him on film and everything. He was hugely popular, Curley, and he was really campaigning hard. But even then, Curley I don't think he fully appreciated that ancient transgression of his back, the taking of the test at the turn of the century, precluded him from ever being rewarded by FDR with a post that he wanted. He wanted to be the Secretary of the Navy.
Right.
And Roosevelt said no. And he let him on, I think. He didn't want to tell him initially. And then Curley wanted to be the ambassador to Italy. And even that, the president said no. And I think it's all related to the fact that he's stained by this event in his life. So he's still paying for it always.
Yeah.
I think he was disappointed, terribly disappointed, He gets through with his term as mayor and runs for governor, and he wins against Gaspar Griswold Bacon. It's only a 2-year term in those days, and he works very hard. He's strained himself day and night. He worked as governor, and it was tough too because again we had a hostile legislature. It was Leverett Saltonstall was the speaker, and it was a tough time for Curley as governor.
It's funny you mentioned all the names: Hines, Saltonstall, Tobin's in there. You know, everything in Boston's named after these guys when you drive around the city.
Oh, sure.
You know, also with FDR, you mentioned in the book about California and William Randolph Hearst, who kind of was, I guess, controlling that delegation out there. And there's some conflicting stories. Whether was it Curley that made the phone call, or was it Joseph P. Kennedy, Jack's father, that made the phone call that kind of put FDR over the top? And you do make reference that, well, Kennedy became ambassador and Curley did not. So I guess you can guess who, you know,
maybe
got to him.
It could be, but of course, Joe Kennedy could get what he wanted. Curley could not. Curley, I mean, and again, I think it's one of the things I came to appreciate about it. If you go through enough battles, you wear scar tissue, and people, they don't. There should be an intense scrutiny of people who are in public life, no question. And but you have to remember that there's also room for mischief on the part of people who might be prosecutors, who are going to enhance their career by taking down a person who has a huge, a very large persona, as Curley certainly did. And I think there's a fair amount of that in the fact that he was later indicted on a matter that he should not have been indicted for in the 40s. But one time I was, as president of the Senate, I was chiding a certain governor, I won't name him, but I said, you know, you're down there working in that prosecutor's office down there. I said, and everything was being leaked. I said, did you have anything to do with that? I said, that's in violation. And he said he had, and he was sorry he did it. And he had done it against a prominent Boston politician. He said, I did it and I hurt this particular person. I should never have done it. I said, why would you do that? I said, it just seems like such a shabby thing to do. But he acknowledged it anyway. But he was from an Ivy League law school. He should have known better. I am sure that they have some ethical instruction there, but no, he did it. And but he was. I will give him this much credit. He was honest enough to acknowledge it, and he said he regretted it. I'm sure he did. But people like Curley, like the person about whom I'm speaking, it's a perilous time for him. You know, they take an attitude, these people, that. Well, you've got away with things all of the time. You've been a villain, a buccaneer, or this or that. And so maybe you didn't really do this, but you're going to have to be brought up short.
If you're just tuning in, we're talking to William Bulger, who is the author of James Michael Curley. It's a short read, some personal stories from Mr. Bulger, but a lot of factual information about Mr. Curley as well, too. And you know, you're just talking about when he had done his time back during his time as the alderman. He was later pardoned by, was it Truman in 1947?
Yeah. Truman,
yeah, and I think that's what you referred to when Jack Kennedy refused to sign
that's
on to that petition.
And Truman was Truman was a hard-driving fellow. He had done a lot of hearings as United States Senator about contracts, war contracts. And this was a fellow who was seeking war contracts and got Curley involved. Curley never had received a penny. He never signed he never sent any mail. This is using the mails to defraud, makes it a federal offense. He never attached a postage stamp. And the trial itself was very bad. They should have sequestered the jury. He was getting all sorts of bad publicity. And the judge was saying, well, don't look at Life magazine. And I don't know. And his Judge Proctor down there, it was in Washington, D.C. They did a very poor job, and when Harry Truman, he commuted the sentence or whatever. But he was asked about it one time, and he said, I don't think Curley, I think he was innocent myself. And Truman was a very a tough, ornery kind of person, I think, but he had a fundamental, I think, honesty to him, you know. And I know a wonderful story about him. It's not in this little book, but when Tom Prendergast, who was another boss back in Kansas City, he had come on very bad times, and he drank, and he was really in bad shape at the time of his death. And Truman was in the White House, and every friend of Truman said, you know, you have an election coming up in 1948. Do not go back to that funeral. But Truman, he took the presidential plane one morning, flew back, attended the funeral mass, and then flew back to Washington. I don't think many people would do such a thing. There's nothing to be gained other than, I don't know, to square with himself some kind of a need or something to show his respect to a person for whom he must have had some a deep respect. But he was also, Truman was always being beat up for being Prendergast's guy, you know. And but somehow he had some kind of an affection or respect for Prendergast for whatever reason. And there's a bit of that, I think, in all of us for someone who may have misstepped.
Yeah, sure. And you know, Curley too, kind of what you're talking about, that it's moral. You know, you do the right thing because it's the morally right thing to do. When I was mentioning earlier about, you know, he was always seemed, from the read I get, very, you know, like Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local. And I guess maybe originated with Curley before Tip O'Neill had mentioned it. In the movie, The Last Hurrah, which is kind of the last hurrah, and I think one of the last chapters of your book mentioned this. Frank Skeffington, who's Spencer Tracy, played by Spencer Tracy. You know, you get that sense. Early in the movie, he's sitting in front and open the doors, and there's the public coming into the governor's house, and he's ready to meet whoever wants to meet him. I think you get that. I get that sense from Curley too, that just because I'm governor, I'm not isolated. You know, it's the governor's. The governor is there for the people, and that's what you're.
He took on a very tough personal kind of relationship with everybody around. You know, lots of people really loved him because, again, he'd be the only one. I related in there how I was at the home of his widowed Gertrude Dennis Curley. She was married to him. She married him in the 30s. His second wife, Mary Curley, had died. And she told me that of the morning when a lady came to the door in the house in the Jamaica way, the house with the shamrock shutters, bang, bang, bang. She said, my God, I didn't know what was happening. It was, I want to talk to the governor. Because once you're the governor of Massachusetts, you're forever the governor. And she wanted to speak to him. And she said, I went and I saw him coming down the stairs. And I said to him, shall I call the police? No, we don't call the police. And then the lady came and he opened the doors of his little library and he brought her in and sat her down. He talked to her. I'm told he gave her a few dollars and then opened the door. She was transformed, Mrs. Curley told me. She says, she looked as though she owned the house. She walked by me as though I were the intruder. She said, and she was, thank you, Governor. I enjoyed that conversation. And she was reconstituted as a result of this action, this personal attention from Governor Curley. And when he's out of office by this time, but Mrs. Gertrude Dennis Curley told me, she said, you know, he told me, he says, all that woman needed was somebody to give a sympathetic ear. Somebody she has no one. And times are tough for her. He saw life pretty much for what it is. Everyone experiences adversity. And he knew it. He experienced a ton of adversity. There's one other little anecdote there. When I was talking to her and I was talking to his stepson, Richard Dennis, who's an attorney still in Boston, when we were talking, the two of them said that Curley would always say, I hope nobody thinks that because of whatever I have had to experience in my life, that I have not had a very good life. I'm grateful for my life. I gave it my best, and I have no complaints about it. Now, most of his children, I don't know, nearly all of them predeceased him.
Yeah, right.
I think the only two living at that time were George Curley and Francis Curley. And he, but he wanted it to be known that he had in fact had a very good life, and he didn't want people to feel bad for him. I think he had some kind of, although he laid it on a little thick about, where was I? Saying the rosaries. I'd have to really argue with him, but I doubted it. But he, nevertheless, I think he had an abiding, deep confidence that it's all part of the plan.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, you mentioned that he comes upon a time once in his life where he's broke,
Oh, sure.
and he owes a lot of
Yeah.
fees or taxes, whatever it was, to the city of Boston or to the Commonwealth, and the public
Oh, yeah.
show up.
Oh, sure.
And,
That's
you
true,
know,
yeah.
giving him change, or
Yeah.
and after time he got himself back up on his feet thanks to the
Yeah.
people that he did take the time
Sure.
to listen to, and I'm sure you experienced it as a public official. Whereas many times that's all people want, is somebody to listen to.
Oh,
you,
of course, yeah.
you know?
And it's amazing how they, I don't know, it says a whole lot. Curley had great, I think, judgment. There's a great political philosopher, and he was a member of the Parliament in England, Edmund Burke. I like Edmund Burke very much. He's a conservative fellow. But he said this about judgment. He said it's very, very important. He spoke of it as something you should never sacrifice. You've been elected in a representative democracy to exercise good judgment. Mm-hmm. And his words are this, he said, your representative owes you not his industry only, but his judgment. And he betrays instead of serving you if he sacrifices it to your opinion. Once again, your representative owes you not his industry only, but his judgment, and he betrays instead of serves you if in fact he sacrifices it to your opinion. And I think Edmund Burke is making a point very clearly that you can't give up the judgment. You do have to listen to people, and you do, and you can, I'm sure, adjust your point of view based on the fact that they have to be considered and their ideas considered. But let us just say everybody in the world wanted to go over a cliff. Mm-hmm. Then, and you recognize it, and you know that this is the wrong thing to do. You have a huge obligation to do exactly the right thing, right. And then hope you can explain it to people.
Right, right, and that is a challenge as a public official. We mentioned briefly the movie that came out in 1958, I think. Yeah. And that was the year he passed away, so he probably would never even experienced this himself, even though it wasn't his name, but it was loosely based on the James Michael Curley character himself. Does his descendants, I mean, are they very familiar with the whole Last Hurrah and the fact that it was based on James Michael Curley?
Oh, well, he knew. Oh, okay. He saw the book, and at first I think he said something. I'm putting this into the hands of my lawyers, and he thought that this was it was just an attack on him or something, and he was going to sue him for life. But it didn't take him long to realize that Edwin O'Connor had immortalized him. Oh. In the person of Frank Skeffington. And if you remember The Last Hurrah, Skeffington, he's near the end. And he takes his, someone's nephew, Adam. And he takes Adam with him.
It was the publisher's nephew, the newspaper guy.
That's it.
Yeah.
And he takes him around, and Adam becomes more and more enamored of Skeffington. And his wife, his own wife, Adam's wife's parents hate Skeffington. Mm-hmm. And there's a whole lot of that with respect to Curley. Even as I speak of him right now, I know people who would be standing up ready to give me a good argument about this. And I've spoken at the Massachusetts Historical Society and the libraries in Boston, and people have other points of view. But there's I think history is instructive, and they're interested in Boston's history, and he's a huge part of it. And also it's in his influence upon people. Clearly he had an influence on me. I must say this, when the person to whom I dedicated the book, Carl Thayer, taught us ancient Greek. He thought that the curriculum, the classics, Greek and Latin, the Athenians and the Romans, this puts us right in the same kind of learning experience as that of John Adams of Massachusetts, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. Jefferson used to say, I thank God, he said, I get on my knees and thank God that my father insisted that I learn ancient Greek. And he loved what and so, but I must say, I'm not very good at it, but I certainly counted myself very fortunate to run into Father Thayer and to study these things. And they became, in my life, bigger heroes. And but it's only later in reflection that I come back to Curley, and I think I appreciate him more now. I think nobody ever doubted when Curley was the mayor of the city of Boston, he was the mayor. And if people came through the door, no matter how powerful they were, they could not push him around. I like that because he's elected. His name is on the ballot. And when we vote for him, it's better that we think we're voting for him, and we are in fact voting for him with confidence that he'll be his own person. And we see some of the unfair tactics of the press, and he stood up to that. And the press is never going to say, we don't like him because we can't push him around. He won't do what we want. I mean, because the press sees itself as the vox populi, the voice of the people.
Right.
But Curley would say, no, the people who are elected are the voice of the people. You will certainly hear what you have to say, but you're not going to run us.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's a great book. I really enjoyed it. I love politics. I love history in Massachusetts especially, and between James Michael Curley and William Bulger, there's 100 years of stories there between, he started in 1899. And when did you retire from the Senate?
I left the legislature in January of '96, but I had been elected in the year 1960.
Right.
So it's about 35 years, yeah.
So between the two, there's a long transition there. So it's interesting. And your personal stories that you kind of put in, it really kind of brings it to light as well, too. So it's a great book. I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate this chance to say hello to people back up here in this great part of the state.
Yeah.
Lots of friends up here. Many, many, many good friends this way.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time
Thank you so much.
Spend some time with us.
Thank you very much.
That is going to do it for this week's show. Again, this is a production of Ludlow Public Television. We're here at the Hubbard Memorial Library. And if you haven't just catching the show in the middle of it, please tune back in and try to catch the entire thing. Thank you very much for tuning in. We'll see you very soon.